The recent latest trailer for Silent Hill 2 by Bluebird team has left a lot of people being very annoyed about it. And while everyone is focusing more on the costume and characterization changes, I want to talk about something I find a little bit more horrific. And that is what looks to be the change in terms of combat and action design. So for today's video, we're going to talk about the misconceptions between action and horror, and why the only studio that I've seen to do this right lately is the one that originally swore off of action in their horror games. The whole debate over action horror, survival horror, horror action, action horror, survival action puzzle horror, whatever, has been a long-standing one when it comes to the game industry. It is something that has gone and made a lot of things more confusing when it comes to discussing things, as I mentioned in my deep dive book on horror, which you should buy as many copies of whenever you feel afraid of something in a game. So, Silent Hill 2 is considered by many to be one of the best survival horror games of all time. And a lot of people were not exactly too thrilled when they heard that Bluebird were going to be the ones to develop the remaster of it. Or should I say remake, I think we're at right now. And the footage of today's show, of course, saw very different character models and depictions of the main characters. But the part that I was very much concerned about was when they showed this scene where James shoots one of the nurse mannequin things, whatever we want to call them, shoots him twice in the legs to kind of down them, and then perform a finishing move on them, kind of like what we see from Resident Evil 4, and I think even 5 and 6 had that. And when I saw that, my heart kind of sunk a little bit, because it doesn't seem like they get the point of good survival horror action. And a lot of developers do not get this point. Part of what led to this kind of weird reshuffling of horror in the late 2000s and through to the 2010s was this kind of embracement of action and then a complete denouncement of action at the same time. So the success of Resident Evil 4 led, of course, to the popularities of games like Dead Space. It led to kind of this militarification of a lot of horror games, where, yes, there's a spooky monster, but now you have a fully automatic AK-47, a double-barreled shotgun, rocket launcher, nail gun, rail gun, any kind of gun and explosion that you can imagine. And a lot of people, again, make this very poor assumption that if there's a scary monster, then the game must be scary. Conversely, if the game doesn't have any creepy monster in it, then it can't be a scary game. And the whole confusion over action horror versus survival horror is very indicative of this. That games like the later Dead Space, like the first Dead Space, I would say would be more, it would be maybe 70-30 action to survival horror, but later games became more and more action heavy. And the problem, and where a lot of developers really tend to fall on this point, is what is the focus of combat? And more importantly, is there a focus on combat? So, to go with Resident Evil 4, both the original and the remaster, anyone who calls Resident Evil 4 a survival horror game does not understand horror at all. Yes, again, there's creepy monsters. There's people with their heads that explode, and the nub of their head grows tentacles and claws, and things trying to kill you from every which way. It's also a game where you can solve a lot of problems just by throwing flashbangs at everyone. It is not meant to be a survival horror experience. And part of this distinction between the two is the depiction of action and the power of action that goes with it. So with the depiction, as we've said, one of the biggest shifts between survival and action horror is the escalation of enemies. When you play a game like Dead Space, Resident Evil, even the Alan Wake games, and a lot of other action-heavy horror titles, the player is put into combat a lot. I mean, a lot. Like, usually sometimes 3 to 5 enemies at minimum, maybe even more than that, and especially waves. That's another big part about action horror versus survival horror. If there are enemy waves that you have to defend against, it is not a survival horror game when you have wave-based combat. And this kind of aggression kind of, again, misunderstands the point and the depiction of action and combat in horror games. The difference between action horror and survival horror is very simple. Action horror, you want to engage with the enemies. You are given the power to engage with them, regardless of the type of gun, explosions, special powers, psychic telekinesis, whatever. Survival horror, you don't want to be engaging with the enemies. And this is for several reasons. First, ammo is rare. It's supposed to be limited. You're not supposed to kick open a barrel with yellow paint on it and get 87 bullets. You're not supposed to just be able to walk down the store, get, a super upgraded shotgun, 10 grenades, 7 flashbangs, 6 incendiary bombs, and so on, and go to town. You're supposed to be limited. The other point is that combat is supposed to be messy. And this is, I think, the kind of point that a lot of developers and fans really mess up on when it comes to survival versus action horror. When you play a game like Resident Evil 4 or the Dead Space ones, combat is very precise, especially with the remake of RE4, even going to something like RE8 as well. That you have complete control of aiming your gun. You're supposed to be getting those headshots. You're supposed to be using the environment, everything around you to your advantage. There's a preciseness to combat, and it's the same that we see from, a lot of action games. The Call of Duties, Doom, Ultra Kills, and the like. That combat is very intuitive. It's supposed to be you in control over combat. In the survival horror setting, combat is supposed to be messy. It's supposed to be violent and destructive and chaotic. It's not something where the player is supposed to be in control. And again, whenever I talk about this, I always go back to one of my favorite examples, and that is the suit-up scene from Evil Dead 2. Ash is looking badass as he gets the shotgun and the chainsaw and says groovy for the first time. And then that is immediately followed by about 5 minutes of him looking completely scared and horrified, going down into the cellar. He's armed with weapons. He's got all the boomsticks and chainsaws in the world. He's still absolutely terrified of fighting a Deadite. And that is the kind of feel and aesthetic you want out of survival horror. You can fight. You got a gun. You got your fists. You got a knife. You can do all that. But you don't want to fight. You don't want to engage with these things. I mean, what's going to happen when some 15-arm, 7-tentacle, and 3 of the tentacles have blades and the other ones have heads on them and they're spitting acid and pus at you? What do you think's going to happen when you try and engage in melee with them? You think you're going to get through that hitless? And again, this is kind of that distinction between action and survival horror. Action horror, you're going to get out of most conflicts relatively unscathed if you know what you're doing. Oh no, 5 enemies are charging me. Throw a flashbang, do some stealth kills, get a shotgun, knock them out, bing bang boom. In survival horror, even 1 enemy, 2 enemies, is like fighting a million of them in other games. Alan Wake 2 gets close to this to some extent, but it still, in cases, gives the player, I think, a little too much power. I do like the use of a crossbow and making it a single shot, or using the magic awards a double shot kind of sniper weapon. But again, the point of good survival horror combat is to not make the player feel overly powerful. You still want combat to be a tool in your toolbox. You don't want it to be the only tool. It should not be the best and only answer to all your problems in these games. And again, this is something that we see in a lot of stealth and stealth-based horror games, where you have the ability to do stealth attacks. Well, if I can just walk behind someone, go like that, and they die and they never get back up again, why should I be scared? Why should I even engage in normal combat when I can just wait for them to look behind, one hit, done, move on to the next enemy, eventually just knock out every enemy on the map, and you're good. So to get back to my stinger at the beginning, the most, I think, surprising aspect to me in terms of action horror and survival horror over the last few years would be Amnesia: The Bunker. And the reason why is that Frictional has really come in a strange, horrific full circle in terms of their depiction of action horror in their games. Now again, longtime fans of Frictional knows that they were the creator of the Penumbra series, which would be kind of the precursor to Amnesia. And in Penumbra, you can fight. You can, use a weapon, shoot a gun, just as well as you can solve puzzles and pick up physics objects and throw them at things. And it was good. And a lot of people, again, have had this kind of clash between when they went to Amnesia and that other horror game that I do not remember off the top of my head. Maybe it will come to me after I'm done recording this. But there was this interview that I think the CEO or lead designer gave. This was I think right around the time of Amnesia: The Descent or afterwards, where they said, we don't want action in our horror games anymore. We don't find action scary. We don't want to give the player too many abilities. We don't make them to feel too powerful. And a lot of indie developers, as we all know, ran the hell away with that, with the likes of FNAF, Outlast, the many other horror games that have come out over the past 8 to 9 years that have put the player in a locked room where they can't move, or the enemy will just boo and kill them any which way they want. But the problem, and again, kind of what I talked about and what we saw with Amnesia: The Bunker, is that without combat, without any direct interaction with an enemy, the horror loses all meaning. If I know that the second this guy sees me, I'm dead and there is literally nothing I can do about it, I'm not really scared anymore, because either I get through the area unscathed, or I'm dead. There's no in-between. There's no kind of variance or improvisation that goes into what makes good survival horror. If I have a gun, if I have a staff, a crowbar, a rock, whatever, now the game's expecting me to fight. Now that's an option, and it's an option that I need to weigh with everything else. It's not a case of, again, wandering around with a double-barrel shotgun while Mick Gordon is playing in your ears as you rip and tear. It's, I have a shotgun, but oh my god, I have to use it against that? And that thing just, is crawling on the ceiling and is jumping down, and he's coming at me and roaring with 7 mouths. I gotta shoot that thing? What do you expect me to do, game, with a shotgun? And yet, what does a game expect you to do with it? And what made Amnesia: The Bunker work so well in this respect is that you can use weapons. Each time you can actually do enough damage to the monster, it causes them to retreat. But then the amount of damage you need to do to kind of scare them off grows each time you do it. So stealth and hiding and avoiding is still a viable strategy. But you can now use the environment and the tools in it as part of your repertoire. He's chasing behind me. Well, guess what? There's a trip wire trap right there. I'll just sneak underneath it. He'll come running, boom, and he'll get run off. So yes, there is still this element of power. You're never going to lose that with any kind of weapon-based system. But it becomes a part of your survival options, not the only option. One of the things I didn't like about games like Alien Isolation, and even stuff like some of the public combo games that do have combat or weapons you can find, is that, again, it makes the combat so, I don't know the right word I want to use here, I guess so black and white, that, okay, I can use my guns, but the enemy's immune to 9 out of 10 of my weapons. Until I get the big bad shotgun, or the super flamethrower, or the rocket launcher, or whatever, then I can hit the enemy, and he gets stunned for maybe 10-20 seconds. See, the enemy in Amnesia the Bungler does only get stunned for a few minutes, but again, it's any weapon that you can use. If I have enough bullets, I know that my next encounter will be relatively safe no matter what happens. But then, of course, the question then turns, what do I do for the encounter after that? And the encounter after that? Again, you want the player to have combat as an option. You don't want it to be the only option that they can rely on. You don't want the player to feel like they need or they should fight every single thing. They should have to fight something. But that fight should be, again, like a drag-out fight that it's going to be so horrible in terms of trying to hit this thing, or it's going to be so dangerous to fight that you shouldn't want to do that. And again, the ultimate difference between survival horror and action horror is this. Action horror will throw you into a room with 5, 10, 15 enemies, and that's a challenge. Survival horror will probably put you in a room with just one enemy, 2 enemies, maybe that's about it. And it's going to be a horrible, messy fight that is going to test you. And if you can make one enemy, just one single enemy against the player with a gun, a sword, a crowbar, shovel, you name it, make it a tense and just stress-inducing experience, then you've done your job as a survival horror designer. So to wrap things up, the Silent Hill 2 remake is... I'm holding out hope, but it's not as much. It's on I guess it's on life support to keep with the Silent Hill 2 theme. What do you think about the Silent Hill 2 remaster? And more importantly, can you think of other horror games that I've missed that have done a good job of making combat a tool the player can use, but not the tool that they can use? So like I said at the start, buy as many copies of my book that will keep you safe and secure and sleep soundly at night. And I'm curious again to hear what your thoughts on Silent Hill, horror, action horror, survival horror, and if you see any new inventions of horror, let me know. Well, that's everyone. Hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching, and a special thank you to our Patreon supporters. If you enjoyed the video, do the YouTubing stuff. Be sure to visit our Discord and Patreon, and you're interested in more in my thoughts on design, check out my game design books.